FlexTrack is the platform that guides the healthy collaboration of red and blue teams to get the daily security work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Blue teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits through simple visualizations of risk, scanner, and ticketing integrations. Enhanced analytics allow you to effectively communicate risk in real time. FlexTrack is perfect for remote collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/FlexTrack to claim your free month today. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Just a couple of quick announcements, or at least one. Having way too much fun with webcasts. We did a webcast today with Core Security, now a help systems company, and my contribution was essentially looking into some vulnerabilities that you may or may not incorrectly classify and or prioritize, showing how you could exploit those in very much a manual manner, and then transitioning into Core that can very much automate some of those exact same vulnerabilities, which is really interesting. Our next webcast is learning how to identify hidden vulnerabilities in your application with Sneak. So you can register by going to securityweekly.com/webcast. We will have basically an online demo of an application that is vulnerable largely to software composition analysis, and show how those could be exploited, and then show how you discover and show the differences between some of the more commodity and open source methods and the differences between some of the products that exist in this space, and where transient libraries, the dependencies of the dependencies can really come into play. So that is with Sneak, who also I rely on for a lot of great information about how to secure and harden Docker containers as well. I've actually referenced many of their posts and papers on that particular topic. So excited we have the CEO and founder of Sneak on, as well as technical resources from Sneak to talk about that. And another announcement, Layer 8, as are many conferences, including Black Hat and DEF CON, are going largely virtual this year. It seems to be the trend, unfortunately, in this pandemic. However, fortunately for us, the conferences are being held virtually. So Layer 8 is being held on June 6th. That is a Saturday. Security Week listeners, more good news. Will save 20% on their ticket by visiting layer8conference.com using the promo code SecurityWeekly before selecting your ticket type. Also, when you purchase a ticket for Layer 8, you can choose to support one of their partner organizations, so please do that. Also, the Security Weekly team will be in the Layer 8 Discord channel in our own sub-channel on there, answering questions during that event. So, lots of, well, I guess the first thing we talk about is Black Hat and DEF CON this year is now a virtual event. I don't know what that means. I actually went to go register for Black Hat today, at least to see what was, the registration process. And it basically was a page that was like, hey, we're in transition with our systems and, come back later. I was actually planning on taking some training at Black Hat too. I didn't check the training registration page. I was early on kind of hopeful that DEF CON would be some kind of in-person event. Obviously that has changed, and it is a virtual event. I have not looked on the DEF CON site to see what some of the details are. What I really wonder in all of these virtual conferences is, what is the technology that they're using, and what's the experience going to be like? I don't think we're really truly going to know until these events happen. And it seems to me that every event has kind of a different take. We mentioned Discord. Black Hills has done a great job with some virtual events as well. And we know the technology is being used. These larger conferences are using different technology. And it remains to be seen what the experience is like from a presenter, from an attendee, from commiserating in the various communication channels. Also, what your experience is going to be as a vendor. Black Hat, of course, vendor experience is something that I've relied heavily on to connect with the security vendor community, and that will be virtual in some sense. And I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like. So remains to be seen.
Yep.
In any case, it's going to be an interesting journey. So,
yeah, Paul, I don't think they are. They really know what's going to happen, or I suspect a number of them are still figuring out how they're going to deliver, what it's going to look like,
yep.
And what the feel is. All we know is it's going to be different, and it may be great, it may be bad. Some people like it better.
Yeah,
who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I do remember that Black Hat training is going to be virtual.
Yep.
But again, that's about all we know.
Right.
So.
And certainly there's a big difference in online training platforms versus online conferencing platforms versus online like vendor booths that I can visit. Those are almost three different experiences, certainly, but different platforms as well.
Yep, and it's been interesting. So even just because we've had to do this so fast, I heard Sam actually brought it up that there was a security conference in Animal Crossing.
Animal Crossing.
It's a game from Nintendo.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that
virtual
game.
World.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that a town or something?
Yeah, no, it's a game with like an island. And
is that like Second Life?
It's kind of like a Second Life type of thing, but on Nintendo. There was also I can't remember the name of the group. They did a virtual reality based con.
Yeah, is that the one Dave Kennedy presented at? And he has some screenshots on Facebook.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the conference as well. That one seemed pretty cool, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly, and I know some of the folks over there, and the name of the company is escaping me. I can find out. It's easy enough. But I know people over there who helped put on that con, and that sounds amazing. And if DEF CON could do that, that might bring a whole new experience to what's going on. I
think your sentiment of new experience is spot on, Larry, because an in-person conference is a completely different experience from a virtual conference, and you can't necessarily take, these are conversations we're having today, you can't take what happens in a in-person conference and directly replicate that in a virtual conference. It's just different, right? And I think that the folks that have been doing virtual conferences have an advantage to make that a better experience because they've got basically experience doing that, right? So I hope this all comes together this year. And I'm looking forward to next year where we can get back to in-person conferences. And look, I'll tell you what, I miss people, and especially when we talk about conferences, my Google Home devices, the ones with the display pictures from my Google Photos feed, and many of them are folks who are hosts on this call and good friends of mine in the past 20 plus years in this industry. And every time I look at one of those pictures with there's one that keeps coming up of me and Jay Beal and Jason Street. I love you guys and I miss you. And we're hanging out at DerbyCon and I'm like, I can't wait till we can do that again. I really can't. I yearn for those days. And hopefully it's soon. Like next year I'm thinking is soon, but I'm hopefully next year we can get back to that.
That's exactly it, Paul, right? I mean, you can throw as much technology at it as you want.
Yeah.
But that nothing beats the personal connection of face-to-face.
It's true.
And actually, being able to
embrace Jason Street in an awkward hug, right? Like things like that. You can't replicate in a virtual.
Or like Paul and I, being in Vegas and eating Mexican food.
Oh, and interlocking arms and drinking margaritas.
Interlocking arms with giant margaritas.
Yeah.
The smell of 30,000 unwashed hackers.
Yeah, true.
Which begs the question, and I just solved your problem. When are we going to do these? Actually do a virtual conference and actually do it in VR?
So that was the one, Jeff, is and Sam hit me in Slack and Discord and stuff.
That was the InfoSec Oasis?
InfoSec Oasis, yes.
Yep, and that used AltSpace VR. And one of the organizers there is Sean Peterson. So he was one of the organizers. So we can definitely reach out to Sean.
Bring Sean on the show. I like that idea.
Absolutely,
Yep.
Sean and Trent and Ivy.
Yep, liking this idea.
Well, and we should do the whole show in virtual reality.
I completely agree, Jeff. Sincerely, I think that's
that would be weird.
That would be kind of interesting experiment to see what happens, because it's sort of taking the whole video conference thing and going to the next level and seeing if it scales and see if we can actually pull it off. Would be amazing, right? I mean, people started talking about virtual reality in the 90s, and finally now we have the actual computing power to support it. So,
I mean, I'm still waiting for my hoverboard, so there's
he's
that.
still waiting for his hoverboard.
and my sneakers that automatically tie their laces and go to my shoes too.
I'm saying, where are my
It's now dry.
Yes, that too.
Oh,
My kids love those movies too, which is awesome.
Yeah. Back to the Future. Can you imagine right now?
You can't
We got to
hoverboard over
step to
water.
2020. Wait, don't go to 2020. Turn the dial back. That fucking
Yeah,
sucks.
either go to 2019 or 2021. Just skip over 2020 entirely, right?
You can't hoverboard over water. You're gonna need more power.
Oh God.
Wow. Tyler's like,
Alrighty.
what are you talking about? I don't get it.
Larry's tripping.
Let's go to some stories.
Let's do
Where
it.
do you guys want to start? Is there just a story in there that really grinds your gears, so to speak?
There were a couple of yours that nailed me, Paul, like the Thunderbolt vulnerabilities.
Oh, interesting. So one that I did not comment on. Thunderbolt vulnerabilities could threaten millions of PCs.
Thunderspy.
Yep, Thunderspy.io.
Was that a James Bond movie? No, that's Spy Who Loved Me. And
I mean, there's been a bunch of Thunderbolt, and we've known this was gonna be a thing, and it has been a thing, and there are, I'm sure, agencies that have used this thing for a while, but anytime you're trying to get those speeds and you're trying to do that big of data pipe across something where you have to have direct memory access, even with a lot of the protections built into like the Intel chips at that level, there's always going to be a potential for this kind of bad things to happen. I'm curious to see
I just
how they
knew this
address
was going to direct memory access.
Yeah, and but Intel chips have protection built in at the chip layer to handle some of the direct memory access protection, or sandboxing, for lack of a better word, and that actually was bypassed using this particular method, which makes this all the more interesting.
Yep.
But this is everything prior to 2019, if I remember right. Anything 2019 and below that didn't have a particular technology in it.
The one that really got me is there's definitely a vulnerability there. There's some issues, DMA. The thing that I found that was fascinating was the disclosure timeline. They found 6 vulnerabilities. They found 7 vulnerabilities in total. They revealed the first 5 to Intel in February. They confirmed them. Then they found, and that vulnerabilities 3 through 5 were new to them, meaning Intel knew about vulnerabilities 1 and 2. They didn't know about 3, 4, and 5. They then sent them vulnerability 6, which Intel later confirmed, and then said, hey, Intel, who are you going to inform? And they said, we're going to tell 5 parties. The folks that found it said, wait a minute, they should probably have another 11 people on that, 11 groups on that list, not just 5. So 16 different folks. And then they found yet another vulnerability, number 7, which they informed Apple directly.
So I have a stupid question, because I largely have not used Apple devices in any significant capacity in some time. Thunderbolt is a generic standard, not specific to any vendor, right?
Correct.
That's true. So like USB-C can implement Thunderbolt, right? Like the physical connection port is independent from, or can be independent from Thunderbolt, right?
And most often is.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yep. So Thunderbolt can be run over USB-C or the other connector.
Which makes it
So-
more
so is
confusing
this-
because we have Apple's Lightning connector, which is very much specific to Apple, and Thunder and Lightning, of course, are two different things. Which is kind of interesting, right?
Right.
So these standards are very confusing and somewhat intertwined, especially when you talk about their capabilities in terms of the difference between I'm plugging in a USB flash drive versus I'm trying to drive a display over USB-C is largely dependent on the operating system and the driver that is implementing maybe an open standard in order to do that.
The chip that actually controls that hooks to the port that then ties to the processor and allows the sub chip to actually do the processing. That's where the actual driver comes into play with the hardware.
Tyler, I'm physically excited right now just listening to you say that. Just so you know, the nerd in me is really excited.
So to join in on Paul's Woody for a minute, I mean, this is not a main processor issue, right? Because I mean, any DMA is going to be implemented by chips other than the main CPU. So is it your understanding, Tyler, that this is some sort of motherboard implementation of the firmware layer that is vulnerable? Or
yeah, so does it so Job, just to extend your question, this steps outside of the operating system kernel. DMA operates outside of the operating system kernel, right? We talk about the rings. This is like ring -1, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other interesting part is, yes, this is outside of the processor itself. However, the processor or the implementation of this chip has direct correlation and processing controls handed off to the main processor. And that's where some of the security controls are typically handled for, like where you'd plug into a port. The one that we're talking about requires an actual hook into the board itself. And so, well, yes, you can do this very quickly and, it's not that difficult of an attack. The tying into the board is bypassing some of those controls via probably the hardware path that processor is taking to the DMA.
But this has been a problem for a long time. I mean, I remember almost early days of this podcast, Larry, talking about when it was FireWire, talking about DMA attacks, right?
Yep.
That was the first time I had read up on what a DMA attack looked like. And 15 years ago when we started this podcast, it was FireWire and its various different connection ports as we have with USB, right? And being able to, if you wanted those speeds above and beyond USB a la 15 years ago, you would go to FireWire to get those higher speeds. To achieve those higher speeds, it needed basically DMA, right? Direct memory access to basically bypass everything in the operating system and kernel to give those devices those speeds. And we're still taking advantage of that today.
I mean, the whole point of DMA, I mean, I don't think I'm wrong on this. The whole point of DMA is don't interrupt the processor with a traditional interrupt. Be able to write to memory directly with some sort of chip support to do that. And so it's going to be fraught with potential security challenges because, well, it's an open highway to memory.
Yes.
Right?
Do we dare say peril? It is fraught with peril.
Can't I have just a little bit of peril?
Larry got the reference. I love it. I love it.
So presumably, following on Tyler's comment, that presumably the processor acts as some level of control plane to make some sort of decision as to whether it's allowed or not. Doesn't probably get involved in the data plane, but that decision is an issue.
It's basically like you're plugging this device in, you want speed, therefore we're going to bypass all protections, and that's why for the past 15 plus years there have been potential and even actual security vulnerabilities in this particular process. Essentially, the way I've seen them manifest themselves, and I'm not sure where the article goes with this, is physical access to a device. Particularly, I'm concerned about espionage, right? And the more I hear about certain researchers being tailed or being in other countries giving a presentation when we could do those kind of things, someone trying to gain physical access to their system, I could have the most secure two-factor and strongest password in the world, but I can bypass all of that by sticking a device physically into the laptop and get things like the Mimikatz code, my research on the latest nation state, malware that I'm reverse engineering, and all those different scenarios that we've seen publicized over the years.
Yeah, and it's interesting you raised that, Paul, because I have been personally in a situation in Europe many times, and I think Larry can probably relate to this too, where one of the hotels will literally hand you a device and say, go ahead and plug this into USB-C, that'll give you your display, right?
Yeah.
And it's exactly that scenario.
Yes.
It's like, how much do I trust that device? I'm about to plug into my laptop.
Zero trust of hardware or zero trust of cables.
It's true. Yeah, don't plug anything into your laptop that you don't personally own it and have verified yourself to be trusted, right?
I think the known piece and who they were disclosing to, like, we'll play, this may be like way out there for even me, but like, does that mean that perhaps there was corroboration around, which ones they were keeping, or if they had sold off or allowed certain vulnerabilities to exist for certain tooling capabilities until new stuff came about, like from Intel's standpoint, and having to go directly to Apple, and who they were disclosing to either says or does not say a lot.
Now, I mean, let's just be frank. Many nation states are not disclosing anything they find in terms of vulnerabilities. But that, again, is, we could do a whole segment on that whole thing. We could
do a whole evening on
that. Right? Any nation state, right? Let's say it's U.S. and it's a U.S.-based company. So we're talking about U.S. government and, let's say, Apple. Well, you run into this moral crossroads of, okay, we can leverage this vulnerability potentially for national security. Now, we can debate, it is subjective, in my opinion, leveraging a vulnerability for national security, right? And I'm more sensitive, I think, to this than I was when we first started the show, for example, because, there are, for example, Middle Eastern countries that want to declare nuclear war on neighboring countries and maybe the U.S. And so how do you balance that with, so we've got a 0-day for Apple, firmware and hardware. We can leverage that to help stem nation-state threats, or we can disclose that to Apple and help protect ourselves. And that's it's an interesting conundrum, right? And I also think that the 0-day market is very interesting as well. That I think we underestimate how much, if you found a 0-day in something, how easy and or difficult, I think it's easier than most of us think, to be able to sell that to a nation state like the U.S., maybe some other nation state, and kind of absolve yourself from any moral values that go along with that, with you don't know how you're going to use that. They could use that to protect the world from destruction. I'm not discounting that by any stretch, right? Or they could use that for their country's own personal gain. And you don't know how they're going to use that. And I think that's a really interesting kind of moral thing, especially today. And if you look through our stories, how Zerodium is no longer looking to acquire iOS 0-day vulnerabilities because they have a plethora of them, right? And that's kind of a kind of scary thing, that it's up to certain individuals what happens to these particular cyber weapons. It's even
more scary when you realize that maybe these companies willingly or unwillingly know or don't know where their vulnerabilities or 0 days are going, or we'll be real, how many of them have a network that they can 100% say that no one else is in, and scarfing up some of those 0 days and having those disclosed privately to nation states? Like, that's who I would be targeting. I'd love to have access to all the 0 days coming in, or be sniffing or monitoring those particular databases and networks and chatter.
Right. Or you have the financial means to buy them, but that doesn't mean it's exclusive. We look at VUPen, right?
Yep.
I mean, if you really look into VUPen, they're like, yeah, we're going to sell it and we're going to do some, scrutiny of it.
They're a brokerage company, right? Like,
they're broker. Like, if I broker it to China or Russia or Iran or the U.S. or Israel, like, yeah, okay, like, sure.
And a good nation state, like, even if you are doing good business, like due diligence and all, like, you may or may not be able to validate that third party has not been set up for that specific reason and is squeaky clean. So,
right. It really begs the question, though, when we look at the 0 days that are in use by clearly espionage tools from any nation state, did they develop that 0 day, discover the vulnerability, develop the exploit on their own, or are they going out on the, air quotes, open or maybe not so open market and acquiring those 0 days and with no expectation of exclusivity, right? Even if there is a promise of exclusivity, there may not be exclusivity in that, right? I mean, I like to think that the U.S., we can develop our own 0 day exploits, but largely what I've learned, that's not necessarily the case. And who's to say what percentage are traded on the open market versus developed by one versus, it's just, you don't know. We'll never know.
Yeah. And I mean, that's probably a mixed thing depending on the attribution, misattribution, or the opportunity of, what they're seeing and monitoring on the darknet. Like, yeah, they're going to grab up anything that will give them access to anything. And if it's semi-public, not public on the dark, versus particular groups developing them for very specific missions or, whatever the case may be to integrate into tools, something like Eternal Blue, then yeah, I think that's where there's kind of a, all things are in play. These guys are as much hackers as we are, and they're playing the game for real.
I think it's very interesting when you look at, I believe it was Flame that created the code signing certificate via an MD5 collision. I like to think that, and there was also
pretty manufactured,
right? And there's also references to very famous mathematicians and cryptologists in that particular code. And look, this is pure speculation, right? But I like to think that if you had to pinpoint that to a country, the U.S., and a particular division in that country that's really hot to trot on mathematicians and cryptologists, Jeff, excuse yourself from this conversation, that it has to be the NSA that did that, and then take into account the computing power that you would have to have in order to create that collision attack. I mean, that just speaks to, I'm kind of proud that we did that as a U.S., to be quite honest with you. And I know this may be a controversial, kind of thing, but I'm like, I think that's actually kind of cool. But it's not always the case.
But now that said, you think about doing those MD5 type of collisions nowadays, and Tyler, ListenCon, you had the ability to do MD5 collisions like nobody's business if you played any of the challenge there. Like, that was freaking amazing. Like, the PDF that was delivered as part of that challenge, you modified that PDF multiple occasions, and every time it had the same damn MD5 sum.
And I agree, Larry. That's probably 10-year-old, almost 10-year-old technology at this point, right?
But we're using MD5 still so many places.
No, agreed.
I mean, that's better than base 64 or...
Well,
Route 13.
so it's an interesting point. There's a technology lag because, I remember I was working on my master's degree, now 15 years ago, 2005, and I did a course on cryptography and learned about elliptical curve cryptography. Only in the last maybe 2-3 years has elliptical curve started to enter the mainstream in terms of things like SSH keys and other cryptography applications. Traditionally it was always RSA/AES. So there's always going to be a lag, right? We have to deal with the fact that software implementation takes time.
Now, I do want to go to my story number 6, along the lines of this conversation. And I haven't, to be honest, I don't follow every single detail in this article. However, I think it is extremely fascinating. The headline basically reads that there's new cyber espionage, like basically espionage happening via malware. This framework is dubbed Ramsay. It very much is being touted in the press as tailored for bypassing air-gapped networks. The original research from ESET is linked to in our show notes. I did find that. It was not hard to find by any stretch of the imagination. They did publish some very good research on this. Now, what you'll largely read, I think, kind of leaves much to the imagination. This malware goes through great lengths to discover Word documents, to be able to catalog and encrypt these said Word documents. And as the quote you'll see that I put in the wiki, the exfiltration of some of those Word documents is still under investigation. It will propagate, from what I've read, some of these Word documents to exposed shares and USB thumb drives, where my assessment is, as the malware infects other systems that are outside the air gap, can then identify that there is an encrypted file that was exfiltrated data from an air gap system. There's just my assessment. Again, is very, very awesome article, very, very in-depth from the researchers at ESET. They do say exfiltration of the artifacts is done via an external component that we've not been able to retrieve. Likely, my guess there is that inside of this particular malware, the code structures that are doing the propagation are probably encrypted or obscured or both, right, inside of this malware. So, kind of interesting. I'm always on the look now, given everything that's transpired in the past 20 years, right, for like the next kind of nation-state espionage style malware. I think this likely represents, what's happening today.
Yeah. It's interesting, Paul, that I was reading this article earlier, and they very much are saying, hey, we think we only have one component of this.
Right.
We have the document collector, and we think it might be able to recopy back to a USB thumb drive. So basically, you're getting it to that air-gap network via thumb drive. We think it can come back via thumb drive, but there's also some other things that we know we're missing. Like, maybe they have to go plug something into those that has some special retrieval utility. My thing is that maybe there's some things there that they haven't even considered. Like we had a story a couple weeks ago about turning the fans into a power supply.
And that's what I was looking for. And Larry, it's a great point, right?
A transmitter.
Yeah, I was looking for that. I'm like, where is I'm flickering the screen, turning the fans on and off, like the whole, all these stories we covered, and largely we didn't find that. Now, it could still be in here, is kind of what you and I largely agree on, that we kind of read into, that there is some other kind of exfiltration method that the researchers maybe not have yet uncovered. And as I look in the history of, Stuxnet, Dooku, Flame, it's, it took researchers months and months and months to trace back this malware. And once they were done with one strain, then they went to another and started to put this whole timeline together of maybe this started with Flame and it was used for some purpose, and then they took techniques from that and combined it with techniques from, let's just be frank, U.S. took, had malware that was running around for espionage. Israel had a malware that was running around for espionage that dates back to 2007. When it came time to go, Iran can't have nuclear weapons, we kind of converged and morphed these tools into something that was called Stuxnet, that basically we were kind of forced to say, if it gets out, it gets out, because we need to basically prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. And malware researchers were able to trace this all the way back to 2007, right?
Yep. So Ramsay authors version 2 and 3, you're welcome for the idea about the out-of-band exfiltration methods.
Right. We have a lot of examples of academic research that points towards that, which I imagine is probably in use today in some capacity, but so obscured that we maybe haven't uncovered it yet. Or if we did, people aren't talking about it.
Or it's more simple than we're actually making it. Like, this is not a new technique. It may not be ultra public, but there are several people that have developed, and we've used metadata within inside of Word docs to exfil data in out-of-band, like C2, right? Like, what if the data is actually hidden within inside of the bytes, and the magic bytes rearrange those, and there's a ton of places to hide metadata. I mean, we hide payloads in the metadata all the time. And then you've got a nice out-of-band C2 that then propagates without network and essentially bypasses air gap. But additionally, like, what if this is actually an intel gathering technique, and they're looking for very specific documents that have very specific keywords, and once these documents are encrypted or being exfilled, the important ones are the ones that are making it out and we're not seeing them. All the rest of these are just part of the end game and part of the tooling.
No, and Tyler, you bring up a great point. As you know, I in basically kind of completing some of the research into espionage, cyber weapons, right? I think the thing I had not considered is the long game of the amount of information that you need to covertly obtain in order to create these highly targeted attacks, right? And I want to go back to Stuxnet on this, right? Stuxnet was so precisionally targeted. It was not an overnight kind of thing that we had, obtained this information. There's several campaigns that have to kind of strain together using various tools and techniques, some of those in the cyber realm, some of those in the physical realm, that have to all kind of culminate to go, we can have this precision amount of a strike. To know between nation states what technology is being used, what software is being used, what specific versions of software, hardware are being used for whatever purpose, right, is not something that's obtained within a couple of weeks even, right? That could be a likely a multi-year campaign that is likely an ongoing campaign to collect this information to be able to do those targeted strikes. That was one of the most amazing things to me as I delved into, Stuxnet, was just the entire timeline. That it just wasn't like someone woke up and said, hey, we should create something called Stuxnet, aka Olympic Games, that goes and takes out Iranian nuclear facilities and centrifuges, right? Like that's how I think many of the public that may have read about Stuxnet thought about it happening, right? But it's really these other espionage campaigns that are all not just from one country, but multiple countries in collaboration are contributing together to be able to do, which is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is some interesting malware for sure, and I'd be really curious to see if other people start to gather the documents or different versions of this from other sources, and there ends up being a correlation of either interesting things within inside of these files or interesting files that are being targeted in particular.
Yeah. Also, I think what was interesting to me too, when you look into this particular topic, is understanding the political climate between nations at any given time. In those data points, right, when you look at the researchers that were looking at Stuxnet, Dooku, and Flame, that they were like, what is going on? And it wasn't so much they had to do the technical research of reverse engineering the malware. They also had to do the research of what's happening in the political climate that might be driving all of this stuff to happen, right? And oftentimes, as technical folks, we start to unravel all the technical pieces and then kind of have to go back and go, well, what is happening in the geopolitical arena that might be fueling some of this or some of the motivation behind it? And you may never know the true answer. I get that. But it's certainly very interesting to look at it from both fronts. I'm coughing. Talk amongst yourselves.
Uh-oh, holy
His eyes
crap.
are like butter. Wait.
COVID cough. COVID cough. Stand away.
No,
Move away from the microphone.
Now's our chance to do another story. Quick.
Another story. Yeah, it's just an allergy.
Jeff,
it is
pick.
totally
Jeff,
just allergies, right?
Oh my God.
Oh,
Dude,
they're
don't
just
even get me
awful this
started.
time of year. Yeah.
That's what most people said, and then next week they were intubated.
It's so interesting. I've been looking at some web application vulnerabilities, particularly this week. Tyler is already laughing, right, because he knows my kind of struggles, and I was so vindicated. Where I was like several hours later, I came back to Tyler and Corey, and I was like, "This vulnerability is not a real vulnerability. Like, you got to be authenticated, and it only takes you to one page." And they're like, "Yeah, we knew that like several hours ago. Like, thanks for catching up to us, Paul." I'm like, "But at least my answer was vindicated." And web
It's
application,
nice to be vindicated.
right? But web application vulnerabilities, especially today, now that I've gained a little bit of experience in developing applications and specifically web applications, right? Like assessing the risk score and impact and probability of a web application vulnerability, in my assessment today is very much a case-by-case basis and very much a manual process. And, the exercise I went through was DOM-based cross-site scripting. And I tell you what, you're running these web application vulnerabilities, and if you're not doing it all the time, you're like struggling with what question do I ask first, right? Like I had to read documentation about the DOM as it pertains to JavaScript, and then if it's jQuery, how is that implemented? And then relate that back to my specific instance of, okay, it's a DOM-based cross-site scripting. They're using jQuery to call this particular thing, and then go read the JavaScript code and research certain lines in the JavaScript code and how it's called to come to the determination that basically this one finding is not really a finding because the user needs to be authenticated, essentially is the conclusion I came to. Then I started applying this same logic to other web application vulnerabilities. And it's super hard to apply a score. And what I noticed in particular with XML external entities, which can allow for a lot of things. One is essentially kind of like a local file inclusion, except it's not local file inclusion. It's called XML external entities. One of the things you can do with that is potentially read internal files. But which internal files could you read and could you not read, and what data they contain? All of these are variables that play into the risk score, which largely, I got to tell you, if you're looking at the CVSS score, it doesn't really relate, right? It is on a case-by-case basis. So Palo Alto Networks comes out and says, hey, we fixed a bunch of stuff. One of those is an external XML entity. And by the way, we're not going to give you any details about how this vulnerability is exploited. Therefore, you've basically obfuscated a bunch of the details that I need to evaluate the risk. Which files can I read? And what are the limitations of it, right? That very much plays into a lot of modern web application vulnerabilities, which in my research, which I put a link to in here as well, largely get a score of a CVSS version 3 of 7.5. What does that mean? 5 is like medium, 10 is really bad. So this is like Matt Alderman said to me earlier. He's like, when I read instructions on how to cook stuff, what the hell is a medium high heat? What does that mean? Is it medium or is it high? 7.5 is somewhere in between 5. It is exactly in between 5 and 10. How do I evaluate that? And if you look at the CVSS for web applications, even in the past 6 months, which is the link that I take you to in the show notes, right? It's some of those are remote command execution. Some of those are XML external entities. Some of those could be maybe DOM-based cross-site scripting. It runs the gamut. So what does that score even mean? Is my point. End question.
Well, there's some fundamentals though, Paul, that a lot of people haven't realized that web applications have fundamentally changed completely. Unless you're writing in the historic model. To be that they've changed into a thick client. And the thick client is a JavaScript-based framework.
Yep.
And there's some sort of XML or JSON-based data that's going back to an API in the back end.
But exactly the point, Job, right? It could be jQuery. It could be just straight JavaScript that's interacting with the DOM. It could be maybe some Java, JSON web tokens thrown in the mix as well. It could be, in this case that I was looking at, ISAPI, which is kind of similar to a JSON web token, right? And there's all these different technologies, all these different ways to implement it, largely within JavaScript, via your different APIs and frameworks. And how the specific vulnerability relates to your application in this specific case, to put a score on that, is just mind-blowing to me how you attach a score to that. Right?
It's not science.
It is.
I agree, Tyler.
It's extremely complex, but it goes even further than that. In the pen testing industry, we have a serious problem because we have now a deficit of tools in terms of in-browser technologies, because most of the testing effort has moved either into the browser or I maybe should say into API fuzzing. And so you have got to get into that browser and you have got to understand exactly what's happening in that JavaScript framework.
Yep.
And your Burp Suite Pro or whatever, it's just not going to tell you much.
Well, no.
Right?
So, but what John said, because I asked John Strand this, I'm like, dude, so I'm using Burp Suite because it's what I've always used for web app testing, and I'm like, and I ran the automated scanner, both active and passive, right? And I'm like, it was really kind of high in the false positive, and what John said was, I think, very true. He said, Burp ends, errors on the side of caution. If it thinks there can be a vulnerability, it's going to flag it. It's up to you as the tester to verify that. I'm like, raise my hand like I did that, and I spent a few hours doing that and verifying it, and it was a false positive. Now, I learned a lot in the process, right? That doesn't necessarily help my client, who I'm trying to do this web app pen test for. But it also, to your point, Joff, it really means as a web app pen tester, you've got to read and understand all the JavaScript that's being loaded into the browser. And holy crap, what an awful job that is. Because the JavaScript that I was reading, and you probably run into this, JavaScript I was reading, they ran through an obfuscator. And the obfuscator replaced all of their descriptive variable names with A, B, C, D, E, and F. Yeah, and I'm like, oh my God, I want to shoot myself. Like, where is the bottle of bourbon right now?
Painful.
No
wonder there's a drinking.
Joff, what is one of the tools you can use to do the deobfuscation? I know, on what is it? Mobile reversing and that type of stuff. Was it JetX that can do that?
Yeah, there's a few websites, right? That if it's so the case I was in was really interesting. Is they, like I said, they replaced the variable names with A, B, C, D, and F. There's obviously other ways to obfuscate Java. It was interesting. What was the course from someone that in order to register for the online lab, you have to solve a puzzle? Which one was that, Tyler? I think I sent it to you.
Hack the Box.
Hack in the Box, right? To get in the Hack in the Box labs, which are awesome, from what everyone tells me, you have to solve a puzzle. So I'm like,
he hasn't solved the puzzle yet.
I'm like, no, so I did, because I'm like, if I can't solve this puzzle, like, you need to pull my hacker card right now. And so I'm like, I'm going to solve this puzzle. And part of the puzzle was essentially, part of it was deobfuscating the JavaScript, and then, I don't spoil it, but part of it was to deobfuscate the JavaScript. And there's sites out there that do that for you.
And JavaScript comments.
Well, there is. Look, I can tell you, I'm not good at this. I'll be the first to admit.
It's super hard, dude. I agree, and I admit it is. The number of web frameworks, right? It's super hard.
It's tough. Like, so what I tend to do a lot is, rather than deobfuscate, my first thing is just to beautify.
Yep, beautify.
For lack of a better word, the JavaScript. Just so I can read it. I don't really give a shit what the variable names are, but being able to read it with proper indentation, that does matter to me.
And the browser debugging tools will largely do that for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So whether it's Burp, some sort of Burp plugin or a browser tool, that's important. But I think there's a real opportunity here for a lot of research and a lot more browser plug-in security frameworks.
Agreed.
That actually work in conjunction with things like Burp and will actually do some analysis on the JavaScript that's happening in the browser. And I'm pretty sure that's not an easy thing to do, but there's opportunity there right now because the world is totally shifted.
And before we get to Jeff, Jeff brings up a great point. Very much an integration between your browser and the debugging frameworks inside of the various browsers and your web analysis tool like Burp would be an awesome integration. Jeff.
So get your drinks ready. I have to interject a PCI context to this whole conversation.
Shit. I'm going to drink now.
You know what's funny, Jeff? I was doing this assessment as a result of a PCI finding, as you and I have talked about, and we can probably look for an upcoming segment on Security and Compliance Weekly on this.
So, and I listened to your webcast today, and you brought up pretty much the same issue. What's 7.5 mean? And my first thought was it doesn't matter, because if it's an external vulnerability scan, which in the PCI world is more commonly referred to as an ASV scan, you have to remediate all findings that are medium or higher, which according to CVSS score is 4.0 or higher. So I'm like, in the back of my mind, I was thinking 7.5. Who cares whether you want to call it 6.5, 7.5, 8.5, 9.5? It's above 4. You got to fix it.
And I would. So I'm going to stop you right there. I'll give props to PCI on that, because as a tester, I completely agree. Because if not that 7.5 is the issue, the other vulnerabilities that are 4.0 and higher likely can be kind of strung together to accomplish a goal. So props to PCI for that. I like it.
All right, but here's where it gets tricky, because you have to look at it a couple different things, because I think we're blurring, or we're going back and forth between whether it's a vulnerability scan or whether it's a pen test or whether it's a web application pen test.
Yep.
And for better or for worse, PCI looks at those things differently. So here's the nuance that I want to give you. If we're just talking a vulnerability scan, that's pretty straightforward. It has to be performed by an ASV. And as I said, if there's a finding 4.0 or higher, you have to do something about it. And it's a scan result, and the ASV company is just going to assume that the finding is correct. It's up to you, the company, to say, no, it's a false positive, no, it's a this, no, it's a that. But if it's an issue, you don't really argue whether it's an issue or not, or how bad the issue is. And I double checked this with a good friend of mine that ran an ASV practice. They don't really care whether it's exploitable or not, or how easy or hard it is to exploit it. 4.0 higher, fix it. Or come up with some sort of mitigation.
Right. That's
from a vulnerability scanning perspective. Now, from a penetration testing perspective, which is a different requirement for PCI, they want you to do internal and external penetration testing. They've defined it these days, I think, as a version 3, that the penetration test needs to include application layer as well as network layer testing. So somewhere in your methodology, you got to do both. So it doesn't specifically say web application pen test, but here's the difference. In terms of passing the requirement for PCI, A, you have to do it. B, you have to remediate any exploitable vulnerabilities that are discovered. So there is no ranking or scoring. It is in this instance whether it's exploitable or not. Now, the third thing I want to share with you guys is, there really is no, other than what I just said, there is no specific web application pen testing or vulnerability assessment requirement in PCI. There is, however, a requirement that says if you've got public-facing web applications, you either do some sort of web application assessment or pen test, or you do some sort of protection, which most commonly people use a WAF, argue the merits of it or not. But if you go the route of doing some sort of web application assessment test to meet the 6.6 requirement, there to pass, you have to protect. You have to fix things so that you're protected against known attacks. That's the language that's used. So in the context of meeting 6.6, you've got public-facing web apps. Your argument about who cares what the score is, it does matter whether you're there's known attacks. If you're meeting the ASV scanning requirement, 4.0 and higher. If you're doing your pen test and you have findings, you got to remediate anything that's exploitable, which is different, I believe, than known attacks. Exploitable, it's possible. It's nuanced, but it's different.
But it continues my newfound respect for PCI, because having been in this situation, and Jeff and I have been close communications with someone we're helping out in this respects, I'm like, I don't control the code behind this web app. It's really for a retailer for a very specific purpose, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to implement a VPN. I'm going to take it off the public internet and make them have a VPN, which, as we all know, is probably the best path anyway. And if PCI is pushing me in this direction, I'm like, Jeff and I are kind of like, that's what we would recommend anyway. Like, regardless of whether the vuln scanner finds it as a 4.1 or a 7.5, or whether or not I can find that vulnerability or other vulnerabilities. There's an inherent amount of risk there, and the right answer is, in this case, we came to the conclusion, like, put a VPN on it, take it off the public internet. That satisfies the PCI requirement. And Jeff and I are in agreement, like, yeah, it's probably more secure that way anyway. And hence my kind of newfound respect for PCI, basically pushing retailers into a more, from what we would deem as security professionals, compliance aside, just a more secure environment and a much better recommendation. Like, hey, if this doesn't need to be hanging out there on the internet, like we could debate the nuances of CVSS scores and exploitability all day long, especially as, you know, Joff and Tyler and I were talking about the nuances in web apps. Like, just, you know, don't expose the risk. And that I like. And that's the decision we came to in this particular scenario. And I think the best decision for all people trying to protect card data, right?
It's taken me how long to make you understand?
Yes,
that,
I know
that PCI at the end of the day is reinforcing security best practices.
I agree.
And it's the basics.
It took me too long to get there, Jeff. It took me too long to get there.
My failure.
Yeah,
we're too interested in drinking.
Yeah, I think conversations like this are good to, you know, kind of highlight in our experiences, you know, how we view this stuff. So, good.
But I'll acknowledge this though. It takes knowing security to be able to get that nuance out of PCI. If you're just looking at it as here's a list of things I need to do.
Yes.
It doesn't make sense, and so it's treated like a checklist. And if I do this, I'm fine. Mm-hmm. And this is where I had some success as a QSA. It was being able to sit down with the customers and saying, it says this. Let me explain what that means to you, and let me explain what that means in your environment. And by the time I was done, more times than not, they're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, we should do that.
But, you know, I think it's an experienced QSA that can guide people down, like, this is the right thing to do. And I certainly think and I think this is some of our nitpicking on PCI is like, well, we can kind of skirt the issue by doing this other thing. But if you have people that truly understand security, you're like, yeah, no, you don't want to skirt the issue. Like, let's do the right thing, right?
Well, and skirting the issue in PCI language is reducing scope. And to me, it's anathema because I'm like, oh, my God, there's nothing in PCI that you shouldn't be doing everywhere. Right. Why are you trying to hide things?
Yeah.
And I'm losing that argument to the whole ecosystem, but I will fight to my last breath.
I'm going to fight till I'm bad.
There isn't anything in PCI that you shouldn't be doing. But I am learning from my research project with mapping MITRE attack framework to PCI that while I can look at, and I'm focusing on the mitigations aspect of the MITRE attack framework, and I read them and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's in PCI. It's this, and this. I am discovering that there are some that are just straightforward. There's others where I'm like, okay, that's not explicitly stated in PCI, but I know it goes here. And I think that's the nuance and the respect that I'm getting for why people struggle with PCI is it takes somebody, and I'm not bragging on myself, but it takes somebody that knows what it's all about to be able to say, oh, yeah, that's where it goes. And there's a couple I'm finding that, like, it's hard to fit the square peg into the round hole. And it's mostly web application based techniques and findings. Sure. Some of the ones I was reviewing certainly from the first segment tonight.
Yeah, experiencing that. I think VPN split tunneling is another kind of interesting kind of topic in this realm, right? Where, like, we want to do the right thing, but, I mean, we want
to use our printer.
Right? We want to allow split tunneling in some situations, and this is my story number 2. Like, Cisco is kind of shining a light on split tunneling, saying split tunneling is okay in certain situations, and we can help you control that. And I'm kind of on the fence on this. Like, and I think it's a more traditional information security mindset where it's like all or nothing. Like, where, like, there's split tunneling and there's not split tunneling, and, like, you get to pick. And basically what we said over the past years is that split tunneling is bad. you shouldn't do it if you care about security. What Cisco was saying today is, well, we can let you split that split tunneling. And
it's dynamic split tunneling.
It's dynamic.
But there
Larry.
hasn't been a third choice until recently.
Until
and
maybe now.
Maybe the new virtual workforce is forcing somebody like Cisco to come up with a third choice.
Yeah,
because it has been pretty much binary.
It has, and now Cisco's saying they have this capability. I don't know how long they've had this capability, but basically they're saying, and I quote, "It enables IT organizations to identify high-volume applications and data sources and move them to the split tunnel first to make the largest impact on VPN performance with the least amount of effort and configuration." What they're not saying in that statement is how they balance that with security.
Yeah.
I don't see it. I mean, I see a little bit about the security in there where they're using particular pieces of Splunk dashboard, privilege changes, parent processes. So they are analyzing different aspects of the traffic in order to make that decision, which that's great. If we have an A and B decision and it was binary and now we have a third decision and they're like looking at security, all right, I get it. I also see this as a huge place for bypass, exfiltration.
Oh, totally agree. Like, I need to transfer a 2 terabyte file, and then I can make the VPN make an exception for that. Maybe I could lie and subvert, right, Tyler? Is that essentially?
Or I can start forcing large volumes of benign traffic to, whitelisted domains, or using something like Slack as a C2 or exfil channel that's known and accepted, or WebEx or whatever, and forcing it outside of the split tunnel and making them lose visibility. Like, again, anything's going to have the ability for an attacker to abuse, and all of the good things always have someone like me, or really a real attacker that we have to protect against, thinking about how this can be abused. So I think this is a good step from a technological standpoint, and they are thinking about a few things, and it's probably better than just straight split tunneling. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. So here I was looking at some of this while while you guys were talking. Apparently the quote dynamic split tunneling is based on CISA, CESA, which is already part of AnyConnect version 4.2, which creates device telemetry, which then exports its flow collections to Splunk.
Interesting.
Which is used to make the decisions.
Yeah, look, to me, this all comes down to how much of the organizational policy can you enforce on the endpoint? Because if you can enforce all of it on the endpoint, it's a non-issue. But the problem that we've traditionally been facing is we cannot enforce all of it on the endpoint. We have network-based resident things. We have perimeter proxies. We have all this stuff. And so we want that traffic to come back through the organization so that we can enforce a consistent policy. But
Jeff, to your point, and they're a sponsor and all, but I think what Harry was referring to in the case of Edgewise is, if I can validate the identity of the application, couple that with the Cisco solution, I can say, yeah, I know the identity of your application. It checks out. Therefore, you can use the split tunnel to transfer that 2 terabyte file, and you're good. If the identity of your application doesn't check out, I'm like, yeah, no. And Cisco and Splunk don't have that capability in my assessment, in what I know so far. Maybe they do, but they don't have the ability to identify or validate the identity of an application to be able to make that decision, right? They're making it on some other data points that, to Tyler's point, might be able to be spoofed, right? And I think that's where we come to some of the nuances of the controls we have, to your point, Joff, of what's running on the endpoint, right?
That's exactly the issue, right? If you can't, if I'm in a CISO position right now and I'm making this decision, can I consistently enforce everything about my policy to the endpoint in a split tunnel scenario? If the answer is no, I cannot, then split tunneling is out.
Yeah.
Can't do it.
Yep.
Right. I think the problem we're seeing today is the access layer of the network has entirely become the VPN. And so in that scenario, we naturally have people going, oh, wait, my network access sucks now. We have the operational pressure where people are going, it's just not working like it should. Why do you have to take all my traffic back to the corporation? It sucks, right?
Yeah,
Like,
you're bringing up an interesting scenario. The way I configured my VPN on my home Linux PC was very much a split tunnel. And then, I got a demo from Core Impact, and remembering how easy it was to list out all the routes on a system and pivot my my entire attack to that new network, and what juicy targets would lay on my split tunnel. I'm like, yeah, actually, now that I think about it, that's probably really bad.
Yeah, actually, you just reminded me of a scenario where we have some customers. We do an internal C2 pivot engagement. This is something that Black Hills does, which is give us a position on the inside of your network. And some of our customers will ship us a laptop and go,
which is
okay,
funny.
Yeah,
It's funny. John and I pioneered that several years ago, and it was collaboration between. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but John and I came to that conclusion years ago. We're like, dude, just ship us a laptop and let's see what we can do, right? And I'm so happy that we still do that today.
Otherwise known as the assumed breach model.
Yes, assumed breach model. Awesome.
It's the assumed breach model,
Yes.
but here's the rub. I'm traditionally a network guy. So what's the first thing I do when I loop up the VPN? I look at the route table and I map out their internal network. Because a lot of people, when they loop up a VPN connection, they will push down the exact routes of their internal network, and sometimes it's very granular. Sometimes it's like 5, 10, 20 routes.
Yeah, sometimes it's very open, right? You have access to whatever. They don't differentiate. They don't adjust the risk level of a VPN user versus an internal user, right?
Right.
Yeah,
take into account that a VPN user
Class B.
Yeah, is in a more hostile environment, right, Larry, than a user that's physically plugged into the internal network, which could still be issues with, right? But it's a different perspective and different risk level.
Yep. Exactly.
We would have done stuff like that, Paul, in the 90s. It's just nobody had laptops.
Yeah. Or VPN connections were
so we did war dialing instead.
Yeah, and it's funny. I was talking about setting up VPNs, and I'm like, this was the easiest VPN I ever set up. And then I remembered, how many VPNs have I set up in the past? Quite a few, and it was painful. Checkpoint firewalls, doing it was freaking painful. And Larry is groaning because you've been to the state, Joff, all of us, right?
We've all been there.
We've all been there. Painful. Which is why we kind of error. And to be quite honest, I think one of the things it comes down to in security, and Larry, you said you were taking a course, auditing a course in DevOps, right? I think it's one of the elephants in the room. This shit is hard. And I think sometimes we kind of push that to the side. This shit is hard. And so we error on the side of let's make it work. VPNs, as we all can agree on right now talking about it, we're just make it work, right? Because it's complex. We talk about ISACamp keys and OpenVPN and all the routing and how that plays into VPN. It's hard, so we're just make it work. And then we look at it and we go, oh, that's not secure, right? And so many things we do. DevOps is the same way. Been in this exact same scenario. This stuff is hard. There's so many components that have to talk to each other and interoperate. Just making it work is a feat. Let alone making it work securely.
Not only do they have to talk to each other, but where do they talk to each other?
And how do they talk to
each other? And where do you store the damn secrets?
Oh, and
What's your disaster recovery plan?
Don't get us into key management.
Oh my
Larry.
God! And the key,
but it's true. But it's true.
It's true. And vaulting is a better way to manage secrets. And to speak to our conversation we're having right now, it is not easy to implement. I've done research extensively. And
it's so much easier to break into and just laugh at the people for being so insecure for not doing it right.
And Jeff, it's a completely valid point, right? Breaking into this stuff, I think we can all agree, way easier than trying to develop a secure methodology.
Yep. It is.
Yep.
It is. Totally is, which is why we do it.
But now
because we're all lamers at the end of the day.
But now, and I don't want to make excuses for people either, because when I look at my story number 4, I'm kind of flabbergasted that researchers at Armis, I believe, pointed out urgent 11 vulnerabilities, largely in VxWorks operating systems. And there's a reference in the show notes. It was made public in July 2019. Siemens is now coming out and saying, well, some of our stuff is vulnerable to that, and we're just now rolling out patches almost a year later. And in this particular scenario, especially, I'm like, dude, like you're late to the party, man. Like that's bad.
To be
Yeah,
fair,
but they
though,
did it
that's-
a lot
that's pretty much
faster than
all
the
of
3-year
the
development cycle.
True.
Sorry, Tyler.
Tyler?
No, I mean that's exactly it, Jeff. Right? Like this is ICS equipment. You're talking about very, very rigorous standards, testing, and figuring out what gens are out there and the service level agreements around those. And not to mention that almost all of the vendors are still rolling out patches for this. It's not just Siemens, and that it's a little less. The article is a little bit hard on a particular vendor, but there are several others that are doing the exact same thing right now. And this was released last year at Black Hat, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And this is very, very serious because those real-time operating systems, especially VxWorks, is one of it's probably the biggest, and it's on every device. You're talking aerospace, you're talking automotive, you're talking ICS, you're talking manufacturing.
IoT.
This is a big deal.
Well, and I think specifically in this case, it was talking about power regulation.
Yep.
Which, I mean, we need to put this in perspective. And, folks in the ICS crowd have a way deeper understanding of this, right? I mean, this particular problem you could relate back to the Aurora project and talk about, how you regulate power to devices. It's a serious issue. It's not something you want to apply a patch and introduce a bug, right? Because we've all seen this go wrong. When it happens in a Windows environment, some of the worst cases are, user can't access this application until I roll a patch back. In the ICS world, it could very well mean I don't have the ability to control a particular device that's regulating power to the entire grid, which could be extremely bad. Introducing a bug could also introduce other issues that could cause power outages. Like the situations in ICS are a stark contrast to the IT and enterprise world, right? I mean, the ability to affect the physical world way more prominent in the ICS world. So, again, and I'm guilty of it, we can poo-poo Siemens for kind of delaying this, but this is not, a parallel into the IT world where, someone can't access their file share. We can remedy that issue. In the ICS world, it has much more, I think, deeper ramifications. Did I capture that? After several
I think so.
drinks.
And
I think you've closed that out nicely. I think you've closed that out.
It's expensive and it's hard, and it's you're talking about devices usually that are old and take a long time to produce, and people expect to use them for 20 years. I mean, there's a lot of economic factors that go in as much as what you were describing, I think, where everything's wrapped around economic factors.
So I was looking up some of these devices, Paul, and I just they said at the article that the Siemens Power Meter 9410 and 9810 series was had some flaws, and I went and Googled it, and I found one available, the Access 9410, which is a power quality meter. And it's a meter, so I don't know how much it would actually be able to interact with shutting off power and those types of things,
or regulating the frequencies that are fed back into the grid. Right, that was the whole Aurora project, right? That happened several years ago. Right, it was basically about that relationship that generators have with the grid. And I'm not doing it justice. Those in that realm could explain it way better than I could. Right. That's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about monitoring that situation, not regulating, which is different.
Right. So this is a monitoring thing. But now, if you think about stuff like Stuxnet, if I remember correctly, that monitoring was key. If you change what the monitoring is and you spin those centrifuges at a different rate, and your monitoring is off, then that's bad things can happen.
One thing that Stuxnet did that was very much prominent in the books I've read recently is they were, like we've theorized in many different scenarios, right? Like it's popularized in Hollywood, you're sending the good video feed back that is not showing the people breaking into the building. In Stuxnet, they were feeding data back to the monitoring things that said everything was fine, when in the meantime, they were doing all kinds of, or at least 2 very specific attacks to disrupt the centrifuges to cause physical failure.
Yep. And for the record, the Siemens Access 9410 is available on Amazon. It's currently out of stock, but it's $4,800.
Yeah.
Awfully
Yeah, you're
glad the
bringing up
Siemens is available.
You're bringing up a good point, Paul. I mean, the motivation or the goal of an attacker that would be going after an ICS, especially like in a critical infrastructure environment, they're not necessarily going in to steal data. They're going in to disrupt operations. So, it's not what can you do with this? It's just a monitoring device. It's, what can you do with this? It's a monitoring device.
But it's a great point, Jeff, right? It's twofold. As an attacker in this scenario, I want to cause physical disruption. That's one aspect of my attack. The other attack is I want to be able to spoof the monitoring data to tell the operators that everything is okay.
Absolutely. I mean, my very brief stint working for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that's what it was all about. It's little things happen. You got nuclear meltdown, and you got another Chernobyl or Three Mile Island, but you weren't born yet.
And I remember studying that in elementary school. But in any case, the other aspect to that also is in the attacks against Ukraine. Not only, do we have these 2 factors where I want to affect something in the physical world to cause disruption to the grid that's providing power to the masses. Not only do I want to maybe spoof or disrupt the monitoring, what I thought was interesting and really, really evil was I want to disrupt the incident response. So they turned off power to the control room. So the control room went dark. So now my incident response of, I didn't see anything wrong in my monitoring because they were spoofing that. It's forging that everything was okay, causing disruption to the grid, which I'm supplying power to customers. But my now physical realm in the control room, I'm working in the pitch black, trying to troubleshoot that issue. So, attacks against ICS could incorporate all 3 of those elements, which is just extremely frightening to me.
Hey, can we shift gears and talk about the top 10 exploited vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so this list looked slightly different from the list that came from the NSA that we covered a couple of weeks ago.
And if you're on Discord, I took the liberty of just creating a table. They had them all listed out, and it's very lengthy. I just took the CVEs, what are their risk factors, and because we were talking about CVSS scores earlier today, I put down the version 2 and version 3 scores. So that's up in the Discord right now.
So I thought it was interesting that US CERT published this list. They didn't list out the NSA, which we had talked about in a previous story, publishing a very similar list. They talked about Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, FBI, and the broader U.S. government are providing technical guidance, and essentially came up with a slightly different list. That one of the differences I noticed is in this list, they included Apache struts, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, Petya's in here too. I didn't catch all the names of all the vulns, but I did notice Petya.
And Drupal was in this list, which I don't believe was in previous list. They talked about also attacks on VPN, kind of all-encompassing VPN from Pulse Secure and Citrix as well.
What I thought was interesting, a couple things. One was looking at the scoring, and I don't know what all the, I know that each of the CVSS versions have formulas that I've looked at, back when I was at Tenable. I didn't bother to look them up again.
Yes, I think we both were.
But very clearly, just, as an analyst looking at this data, I'm like, okay, the difference between a 9.3 and a 10 or a 7.5, which were the only options under version 2, are probably just like one thing, right? And there's not a lot of variance or gradients to the scoring, at least based on these things. Same with version 3.
Well, Jeff, to your point,
Johnny just threw up your table.
Well, one thing I've noticed too.
It's up now if you want to see it.
One thing I noticed too is that some older vulnerabilities have not been scored on version 3, where
Right. Yeah, and I don't know why.
and that's interesting, right? Like some of the ones I looked at that were a CVSS 2.0 of 10.0 critical were not scored in CVSS 3.0. So if you were just looking at the CVSS 3.x score, it would be basically null, or if you're Python, none, right?
Oh, there's no number. I don't have to do anything.
There's no number. I don't have to do anything. But if you then kind of flip to CVS 2.0, it's a 10. And
Right.
I'm like, my advice to our audience is like, don't discount that. Maybe you need to be looking at both. I'm not sure how, like, technically in your VM program, to be honest with you, that you're differentiating between a CVSS of 2.0 or 3.0. I'm not sure in the various, scanners or vulnerability assessments or management tools that if there is no 3.0 score, does it default back to 2.0 or not? I'm like, I really don't know the answer. So my advice to our audience is just be cognizant of the difference between the two and realize that some older vulnerabilities, and like, let's be frank, like I can look in your list right there, Jeff, that Johnny was kind enough to put to our audience, that there are some vulnerabilities from 2012, and there were other ones from 2012 that I noticed that did not have a 3.0 score. So just kind of a public service announcement.
Yeah, looking
Well,
at
the good news is
of the top
nobody's
10.
using version 3 yet, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at that list of 2010 for the top 10, the second to the bottom, the CVE 2015-1641. CVS 2 is a 9.3, but no score for 3.
Right.
Like, I don't have to deal with that. I don't have
And
to deal with this 5-year-old vulnerability.
I initially got this data because I still go to the Tenable site because they, I'll just type it into their plugin database and I can find it. And they actually have a site where they list all the CVEs and all the information. And on that one that was missing a version 3, I went all the way over to the CVD site, which I think is it MITRE that's maintaining it these days, whoever it is. But I went back to the source and I'm like, yeah, they said they haven't done it yet. They had some little statement about not evaluated yet or something like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So CVE, the one you point out, Larry, 2015-1641 is a vulnerability in Word 2007 and several other Office products dating all the way up to 2013 that execute arbitrary code via a crafted RTF document, which I'm sure none of us have ever used in a pen test, right?
You're so funny.
Yeah, I think most of these top 10, or the majority of them, were Windows-based. Not all, I don't think, but most of them were Microsoft-based. Well, I also thought was interesting, this is based, if you actually look at the list, this is like based on actual, investigations of actual breaches and things like that, going back to 2016. So, some of these older ones, maybe they only showed up in the years that they were published, right?
What I find interesting, too, it kind of plays into your vulnerability management, which we seem to always come back to as a topic. And this is a very interesting aspect of it that, Jeff and I and others on this show really work very closely with vulnerability management in different capacities, right? vBulletin is an open source project. I would consider it a forum software. They call it collaboration software. It's an open source project. Someone found a vulnerability, actually 2 vulnerabilities, in vBulletin, decided to hold back the details, likely in collaboration, with the air quotes vendor, which is an open source project, and say, well, in June at this conference, we're going to release the full details. But release the details to vBulletin, who then produced a patch. But vBulletin is open source. And so many of us in the security community are like, well, if it's open source, I can go to their Git page and basically do a diff and see what's fixed. And actually, if you go to the show notes, I linked to a graphic that someone put on Twitter that's like, oh, yeah, like in this code, and annotated the code to be like, yeah, that's a SQL injection vulnerability, and here's how it's implemented, and here's another SQL injection vulnerability, and basically this CVE is, covering 2 SQL injection vulnerabilities. However, if you look at the vBulletin CVE details, it's like there's a critical vulnerability, and we don't know what it is. But if you know it's SQL injection and you know some of the details, maybe you can implement some mitigating factors. So I'm kind of like, this is that age-old debate. What we provide to defenders for information about a vulnerability can be used to defend. What is also used to defend in terms of information can be used by attackers to exploit. By holding back, do you hurt the defenders? And now that the patch is released, and whether it's open source or not, and there are two different levels there. Like, I truly believe that open source is much easier for us to look at the code and go, oh yeah, now I can clearly see the vulnerability. As with commercial software like Microsoft, I got to reverse engineer the patch, slightly higher bar. If it's Microsoft, maybe not. There's a lot of people that are in the groove of reverse engineering Microsoft patches. I just don't know where to fall. I kind of think if you found this, and especially if it's open source, there is no reason to hold back the details as to what this vulnerability is. We can all see it in the commits on their GitHub page. No? Am I wrong?
Convince me I'm wrong.
Somebody convince him he's wrong. I just realized
what does that mean? Like, what do they say in the meme with the guy that's in the park with the sign? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Convince me I'm wrong.
I just
change my thank you. Change my mind.
That's right. That's right. I don't know. Paul. I just believed everything you said, man.
Open source vulnerabilities should be public once the patch is publicized on the open source, Git repository. Change my mind. Like, seriously, we can all see it. Like, someone posted on Twitter, here's where the vulnerability is, right? I suppose it's a bit of extra work. Like, I don't get a tutorial or exploit code like, here you go, here's how to exploit it. I do have to read the code and then develop an exploit. I don't know. That's not much of a leap there from any of us, right?
Admittedly, if you're pushing that stuff to Git, you can wipe some parts of Git history, but no,
it's hard.
No.
It's hard. In the fix.
First of all, I have much love for Git.
Oh yeah.
I don't. I was thinking about this the other day, Joff. I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm like, Git was created by someone that just doesn't like people, and I'm like, oh, wait, that makes sense now. Never mind.
Yes.
Hey, speaking of not liking people, it's getting late.
It is.
Yeah. So he's got a point. But the reason I have so much love for Git is when I find it on an internal pen test, and I exploit the living shit out of it. Yeah, it's a thing, right? You find source code and things go bad. Things go bad.
Things that should not be in Git or in Git, like secrets.
Yeah, like creds.
Yeah.
But you know what? I think Jeff, in his PCI likeness, might have a point. We probably should wrap it up.
Yeah. My story number one, we should have talked about when we were talking about nation-state attacks. U.S. Cyber Command has shared more details on North Korean malware. Shania's comment is, it's interesting to see the U.S. government take more aggressive stance on foreign malware, making those samples public. And my question is but if they do the same to us, do we still do it to ourselves? If Symantec was one of the researchers, U.S.-based company that found the initial Stuxnet samples and made that public. It begs a very interesting question as to who discovers the malware without knowing the intent and then releases those details, knowing or maybe not know. I mean, in this case, very much knowing. In some cases, maybe not knowing the nation state behind it and the intent of the malware. I think it's a very interesting moral debate as to what details are released on malware that you find in the wild.
I think it is too, and actually that's a multifaceted issue because I'm not the only pen tester that's ever developed some malware and found that it has how do I say this? migrated its way into the defense industry,
right?
To be detected, and I'm still not sure how I feel about that.
Yeah, like, are you now considered a nation-state attack, or?
I mean, part of me feels complimented. Okay.
Yeah,
like,
but the other flip side is, though, if you discover malware and you do realize that it's part of a nation-state campaign that is part of the country that you're a citizen of, what do you do, right? Or if it's a nation-state that's an enemy, what do you do? Or, I mean, we all work together in various companies, right? Like, to say, like, okay, Symantec is a U.S.-based firm, right? But they've got offices all across the globe. Like, where do your like, your
Loyalties?
Thank you, loyalties lie? Is it with the company you're working for? Is it where you're from? Do you not disclose? Like, should we not have disclosed Stuxnet? Because, and who's to say? Like, I guess my question is, like, who's to say in cybersecurity, as security researchers want the good of humanity, who's the judge of the good of humanity, right? Like, is this malware doing good in for whose end and for whose goal? And who's to make that decision, right? That's really some of the questions I've been asking, reading all the books I've had and researching it. I'm like, who makes that decision?
Researchers aren't asking those questions, though. That's half the problem with all of this debate over offensive tooling and what to be released and what to disclose and how to properly disclose stuff.
Right.
Like, people don't take the whole picture and haven't been on the other side of a lot of these conversations. So, like, they can't really speak to it. And, their 5 years in InfoSec really doesn't lend them to the experience that someone like Jeff has that's seen a wide plethora of how this can play out and be able to bring better experience. They just don't think about it. They just do what they want to do.
But, I mean, but it also speaks to the hacker ethos of, like, information should be free, and I came across this information, so therefore should we all know about it, right? Okay, Stuxnet as an example, obviously got way out of control. Does it protect U.S. or other nations by disclosing it because it really was running rampant, right? And what if it had gone wrong and it affected industrial control systems here in the U.S. or other allies, right? So, like, that debate is extremely intricate and very interesting to me. Where you fall as a security researcher, I mean, I tend to fall in the hacker ethos of, like, if I'm seeing it, then we need to publicize that information. But on the flip side, you got to look at the motivations. But how do you tie back motivations today, especially?
But it enters the pen tester world as well, because I don't know of a company. Okay, so let me back up a minute.
Shut up, Jeff. Shut up, Jeff.
I know we need to wrap it up, but at Black Hills we tend to be very open with the things that we're publishing in terms of research. That does not always go well for us.
No,
right?
I agree. That's another moral debate, right? It truly is. The tools that you're developing and sharing.
It's almost deserving of a whole segment sometimes.
Right. It totally is, Jeff. I agree. I know it's getting late, but, are the tools that I'm sharing being used for good or evil? Is the debate we've had, I mean, we go all the way back to the early 90s interviewing people who released tools that were like, yeah, could have been used for good or evil, but...
There's the other side of that as well, and there's more than one pen test firm that does not release stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But it ends up getting into the defensive industry anyway because the customers will upload the malware.
Yep.
For sure.
Privately, not to Virus Total, but privately.
Right. So it's a really thorny and difficult issue, but I don't think we can solve it tonight.
Mm.
No, we can't.
Well, thank you everyone for listening and watching to this edition of Palo Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Over